Welcome to Breathing with Durham, the podcast, a Princetonian Now Media Group production. As always, our job is to educate, inform, and entertain, inform you, my people. And please, if you like what you hear today on Breathing with Durham, the podcast, please subscribe to me on my YouTube page, also on the Princeton Now Media Group, or Breathing with Durham Facebook and Instagram page. Today's guest is a researcher, historian, teacher. He's considered one of the top investigative researchers on domestic terrorism and on the radical religious right activities. He's appeared on WABC in New York, WGN in Chicago, many other radio stations and TV shows. His books include Killing King, Racial Terrorists, James Earl Ray, and the Plot to Assassinate Martin Luther King Jr., Awful Grace of God, Shadow Warfare, The History of America's Undeclared Wars, and now currently American Secret Jihad, The Hidden History of Religious Terrorism in the U.S. He also is a teacher. His Hightstown High School class is working on a bill called the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Act. The man is one of the Renaissance. He's been on Princeton TV back in the past. We welcome Stuart Wexler. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Stuart, when do you have a time to do anything? I'm surprised.
I always say it the opposite way when some of my parent colleagues who I work with, I don't understand how people have time to be. I'm single. I don't understand the folks who are parents and teachers at the same time.
Gotcha.
Those are that I don't even get. So I always tell them you eliminate all the other stuff. There's so much remaining time that you actually can find your time to do some other things.
Yeah, I guess it must be a passion, not a quest. Researching, trying to find out information, get to the truth, so to speak.
Since I've, was a student myself, that's always been something I've loved to do. One of my favorite places to be is an archive. So,
well, I'm happy for someone in their element enjoying what they do. We'll get right to it, though. You wrote from the book, The American Secret Jihad, which I have to admit is a little chilling. You keep on forgetting that undercurrent of America that's always been here, but I mean, you bring it to life. Why is it important to understand this particular element? What makes them unique today and in the past?
So I think it's really important. First off, I think a number of Americans understand that we had terrorism for a very long time. It says something unfortunate that we don't sometimes look at what the Ku Klux Klan did as domestic terrorism, but by any definition, it was terrorism. I tend to focus on a religious dimension to the terrorism that's not nearly as well known or well focused upon. And I think even amongst scholars, the understanding of the religious dimension and how far back it goes is not as well known. And so I think it's really important to understand it because in a real broad sense, the difference between a religious or ideological terrorist and a secular, or you might call ethno-nationalist terrorist, is that and they're both not good, but the secular ethno-nationalist terrorist has limited aims. They're either going to fall or succeed based on whether or not there's some political objective achieved or not. Whereas the religious terrorists, and this goes for the folks that we've gone after with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also to the kinds of folks I write about who are perverting Christianity for terrorist aims, the goals are almost unlimited because their ambitions are so, frankly, kind of absurd that they either are willing to do a lot to try and make an absurd thing happen, and or they're willing to just keep it going until the absurd thing, which will obviously never happen, happens.
Right. Yeah, it seems like they jump through some theological gyrations to justify, their hatred, or the Jews or this and that, and then they link it to modern day current events and say this is part of some kind of prophecy. I mean, the Bowers of the world. Is this true?
So what these folks do is they have sort of and there's a lot in between, but my main focus is on what they have at the beginning and the end of their sort of perverted interpretation of biblical scriptures. Their beginning is sort of a retelling of the origin stories where, Jews are now literally the children of the devil, and people of color are the descendants of the so-called beasts of the field, the mud people, subhuman. And there's this cosmic conspiracy between Jews who are manipulating these, subhuman people of color against the true chosen people, white Europeans. But the more pressing issue, the one that's current and what I focus on, is what they argue happens at the end, which is also a distortion of, conventional evangelical Christian end times beliefs. They believe the end of times, the battle of Armageddon, so to speak, is a holy race war, and where white Europeans will ultimately prevail.
Mhm.
And there's some nuance there that's different from conventional, end times prophecy stuff, but that's where it gets really dangerous, because they believe it's their goal, their job to accelerate that.
So it's like a messianic death squad. I mean, you gave me a little timeline. I mean, in more modern times, for lack of a better word, unfortunately, Henry Ford himself helped start this kind of thing going. And you mentioned Leslie Swift and a man named Bowers. Have you met any of these the Bowers type, what I call the messianic death squad people? I mean, have you met
It's a
them?
great way of putting it. Most of the old school folks thankfully
Okay.
have passed. So you mentioned, so sort of the origin stories, it goes all the way back before we had what we call this offshoot nowadays as Christian identity. It goes all the way back to Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. Even before that, but he kind of puts it in an ugly, or his editors put it in a very ugly direction. And they had hundreds of thousands of readers
Father
back
Coughlin's
in the,
around at that time too, and all
and
that.
then you get, yeah, like you get this sort of anti-Semitic sort of stew, where in which this sort of chauvinistic, white chauvinistic idea about who's the chosen people who isn't gets mixed up in racism and anti-Semitism that was sort of burgeoning in the 20s and 30s. And then these folks in the mid 1940s, right at the end of World War II, kind of officially codify it. These seminarians in California, that includes Wesley Swift, who you mentioned, who's sort of really the godfather of it all. But then he has folks sort of underneath him, or I shouldn't say underneath in an official capacity, but who are really devout, zealot followers. And the most disturbing people, one you mentioned, one of them was Sam Bowers, who was the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. There's another gentleman, J.B. Stoner, who is a racist lawyer terrorist from Georgia, and a couple of other people. And they really kind of sort of execute the plan, so to speak. And then you hit the 80s and 90s, and you get, it's almost, especially by the 80s, it has completely become ubiquitous by then within white supremacist terrorist groups. In the 90s, it continues. It subsides some, but only because people start embracing other religions that are very highly influenced by it. And then our focus shifts almost completely to Islamic, Salafi jihadist terrorists in the 2000s. And what we're starting to see now is a resurgence of some of these religiously oriented ideas, which is very disturbing.
Right, right. You tied it. I've often thought though, what about just quickly a sidebar, Timothy McVeigh, the moral majority. How do they fit into this? Was Jerry Falwell
I would
fascist
I would
light?
separate out. A lot of people ask me this. It really is a distinct perversion of Christianity that you don't quite get from a Falwell, from typical moral majority, more right wing Christian politics. Now McVeigh's an interesting customer, because he sort of uh, dabbled in this stuff.
Oh, he did.
I believe he lied about it. The most influential work in his life was the Turner Diaries, and while it's
Oh,
not
gosh.
explicitly Christian identity,
Right.
it's widely regarded as almost like the secular version of the Christian identity Bible, almost. And so he also so he claims that that book's his major influence, and that it's a because of its anti-gun or its pro-gun message. Anyone who's ever had the unfortunate experience of reading the book, the gun stuff is like a couple of pages. It's 98% genocidal racism and anti-Semitism. Very hard to believe anybody reads that book who's not sympathetic and holds it up like as their Bible and thinks of it as anything other than a horrifically racist book and be sympathetic to those ideas. He also associates with, so he shows up at and briefly joins a Klan group that's very heavily influenced by this Christian identity ideology. And again, he claims it's because he thought it was a pro-gun group. Like, who even regularly thinks any Klan group that their focus is guns, right? So I don't think he was being honest. And then he gets associated with a town in Oklahoma City, not in Oklahoma, in Oklahoma, called Elohim City, which is a Christian identity compound. And he's making calls there, and there's some credible allegations that he visited there. And those folks had been talking about, heck, if you read the Turner Diaries, destroying a federal building for quite some time, including in Oklahoma City. So there's reason to think, I still think he was the driving force of what happened with, Terry Nichols. But did he maybe have help? And certainly was he pushed or influenced in the direction he went because of Christian identity? I think that's a very distinct possibility.
Right. Well, that leads me and people were asking me, because I'm talking to you, even though this is threatening and this lone wolf, is this a direct threat to national security? Is the FBI doing a good job undermining, infiltrating these organizations?
Well,
How
in
much
the
is it
80s,
spread?
in the 80s and 90s, it was a huge source of focus for multiple federal law enforcement agencies, because they knew, especially from the 80s, that this ideology was it when it came to right-wing terrorist groups. So we get a report right before the millennium called the Megiddo Report, and not accidentally with that religious symbolism related to the Battle of Armageddon. They're the two of the featured groups, the Christian identity as being these folks are causing damage and could cause damage. A lot of the focus gets lost on right-wing terrorism in general in the early 2000s, but it's starting to refocus on. The question becomes, are they focused on groups like this, what scholars call accelerationists? I hope they are. I know the young counter-terrorist scholars, the people who are studying it. When I say young, I guess I could call people young nowadays because I'm in my mid 40s, 20s and 30s. They're very much attuned to this now, and so they'll go into forums and look for the kinds of things that I've interacted with them. It will give them tips on some of the things they can look for, and they're finding again that they're doing what I say they did in the 50s and 60s, which is they're insinuating themselves into secular ethno-nationalist terrorist groups and trying to either convert or manipulate those groups.
Like Bowers did, you said, in Mississippi, kind of.
Exactly. So Bowers would overtly be a conventional, Southern nationalist. We need to keep the white Southern nationalists. We need to keep the Southern way of life in place. We need to be willing to use violence to do it. Privately, he was a devout Christian identity guy, and he would say things like, I have to manipulate the rank and file Klansmen because they're just too stupid to know what we need to do. Right. Yeah, he had very contemptuous. That's often, by the way, the case in a lot of these groups. They're very contemptuous of the people who are rank and file and have no problem exploiting them. And so privately, and he didn't know it was he was being informed on, he would be talking about these sort of accelerationist, let's start a race war type of plans. And then he'd go in public and give a different, slightly different kind of message. And he wasn't the only one. There was a lot of guys like that who were just trying to harness the sheer number of people in the late 50s and early 60s who were willing to be a part of violent Klan groups. Because when they tried to do it before Brown versus Board of Ed, the earliest Christian identity folks found them like they couldn't get the audience they wanted, because they would talk about racism, but then they'd start doing violent anti-Semitism. Regular anti-Semitism was okay in Klan groups, but like saying we need to make Jews the number one target, to be like, why? Like regular Klan people be like, what are you talking about? We need to go after black folks, right? It's crazy kind of violence. So instead of trying to offshoot, they insinuated themselves into those groups because they don't like people of color either. They don't like black folks at all. So it's an aligned interest, with the hope that they could eventually turn it in a direction that would also go after, the satanic Jews.
Gotcha. To tie this in, before there's so much to cover and so little time, to tie this into with Martin Luther King and how it might relate, one thing that popped up to me, this embrace with Putin. Do you think some of these, you can't speak for all the extremists, do you think some of this could be like Putin might represent to them some kind of white nationalistic European thing? Or?
Oh, he's like a hero in a lot of right-wing circles.
Oh,
yeah. Oh yeah, because and by the way, not even in like the super extreme. It's an undercurrent of a lot of like mainstream folks. Like you could argue even Tucker Carlson, because he's a nationalist where other people are seen as being globalist, and he doesn't get talked about enough. He uses the sort of imprimatur, whatever you want to talk about, with the Russian Orthodox Church. He's religiously based too. And that's a big appeal to folks who, there's a whole sort of dynamic in right-wing circles that think that America essentially needs to move in the direction of a theocracy.
Right.
And it has currency in like, conservative intellectual circles now. Hey. So yeah, so when you hear people like praising Putin, that's why they don't talk about it in explicit terms. But that's a big reason why.
Identity. Oh gosh. Again, I want to tie into the King book. How does this tie into what happened to Martin Luther King, this ideology, theocracy, messianic stuff, now and today?
So King became the sort of linchpin in a plan to try and create a race war. So late 1960s, you had huge numbers of riots and sort of, or some people call rebellions, violent interactions. King had lost some of his sway with anti-violent protests, but he was the only one left with any kind of, esteem and influence within, the left or, African-American circles. If you kill him, their thinking was that the only thing left would be the violent right and the violent left, and you could escalate into a race war and take it to the next level. And for a couple of weeks after King died, it looked like they could potentially almost get what they wanted. Thankfully, King family and the country settled down. The King family helped the country settle down.
You're right, though, that you think James Earl Ray was more of an opportunist, a career criminal who just wanted the money. He wasn't like an overt racist, from what you know.
Correct. So there was basically the folks with Christian identity influence and who were starting to get under intense federal scrutiny, outsourced the plot through a bounty to criminals. And Ray, and there's a lot to it that people can find out in the book Killing King, Ray gets hooked into the periphery. He probably wouldn't even know what Christian identity was from, Kantian metaphysics or something. Like he wouldn't have any idea. But our argument is that he gets caught up in this plot on the periphery. But the ultimate reason why it happened was because these folks wanted to start a race war and killing King was the way that they felt they could pull it off.
But the King family thinks there was a conspiracy. I mean, you write that James Earl Ray didn't have a change of clothes. You think he acted impulsively, possibly, and he decided to go ahead and do it,
He
or
he had a
he
tendency
was stalking
to have like a limited, well planned out plan, and then a very poor idea of how to follow through in any kind of medium or long term in his crimes in the past. What we think is that he was on the real periphery of this thing and either received or was going to receive a very small share of a bounty. And then he saw an opportunity to get a much larger share of the bounty, but hadn't fully figured out how to get to it. And so he goes after King on his own, essentially, when there was a larger plan that wasn't anticipating him doing so. And so then he gets stuck trying to figure out, how can I get my money? He never gets it, the full money, but he tries to get out of prison for years.
Twice
with
he
hopes
escaped.
that he could, right. So that sort of is, if again we go into much more depth in the book Killing King, but his sort of who he associates with after is a very interesting, when he's trying to get out of prison, is a very interesting story.
And what he says.
And
again, please buy these books. We're going to go over at the end. I hope I'm not moving you. I could talk forever with you, but I want to get the full body of your work out here.
Yeah.
That also, anything you want to say before we get to what you're doing with your Heightstown High School class, which is quite interesting.
No, and a lot of this stuff is all in the two. If you do get America's Secret Jihad, Killing King, you would get an access. You would have a lot of what we're talking about in much depth.
Again, please go on Amazon or your website. And what's your website's name again? We'll say it again.
I just do it from my Twitter. I need to actually do a website. I'm real bad about self-promotion. But if you get it from Amazon, go right ahead.
Okay. Let's go to this. Again, you still teach on the side. Hopefully we get to voices from the crowd. That's what people I ask questions to you directly, go through me. What is the Civil Rights Cold Case Bill, and where does it stand right now? I know you work with the ex-Senator Doug Jones, but what's happening? What is it, and where's it going?
So 7 years ago, my students drafted a federal bill called the Civil Rights Cold Case Records and Collection Act. It creates a group of scholars who access decades-old records on racial murders that were never solved, and tries to release those files in part or in full to the American public. My students then took the next several years, advocated for it, got it introduced by Bobby Rush in the House, Doug Jones in the Senate, and it's been signed into law. They're the only class in American history who has ever written a bill that became a federal law.
Wow.
Then they continued the lobby for appropriations and got those. We lobbied for years to try and get it appointed. The board needed to be appointed. Trump did not appoint the members, but Biden just did. So the board is essentially almost good to go. A couple of new members have to be appointed. And now the goal is to get it extended, because 2 years were wasted not appointing anybody, and possibly add in some more teeth that were taken out of the bill to get it to pass the Senate by unanimous consent.
So basically, you want information to come out faster, quicker, so scholars can look at it and find out it,
And even more than scholars, family members, journalists, historians, but family members who don't know what happened to their loved ones from 50, 60 years ago. And the country needs to know that. The whole country needs to know. So, and it will be available to everybody online once those files are released.
We'll find out if there's aliens in Area 51 and who killed Kennedy. I know.
No, but it's based on the board that did release Kennedy assassination files. Maybe we need one for the UFO stuff too. But this board hopefully will have the same success at releasing civil rights cold case files as the JFK Records Board did with Kennedy assassination files.
Let's go to voices in the crowd. This is from people in Princeton, New Jersey. I told them I'm interviewing you and they want answers to these questions. Stuart, you seem like a really bright person. Do you have any patience, being bright and analytical, do you have any patience for conspiracy theories? It's kind of a broad question.
I think conspiracies have happened, like, you know, the Tuskegee experiment, right? It's just that people, when it's your worldview for how everything happened, that's where it becomes a problem. So you have to weigh each on their own merits. You could have your needle turned a little bit towards skepticism if you don't think things like that can survive. I got to tell you, in recent years, with all the stuff that's happened with Weinstein and Cosby, the idea that you can have a pretty long term, even extended type of conspiratorial operation where it doesn't penetrate the public conscience. I used to be a lot more skeptical than I am now. So, but I generally think a lot of them are nonsense, but certainly I think one happened in King assassination. I think very reasonable to think it happened in Kennedy, and we're going to do something on Robert Kennedy. It's just that a lot of them are a lot less involved than what people, where it's all like the national security deep state. That's
Right.
It's sometimes a simpler, like, small person conspiracy of 4 or 5 people or something like that.
Right. Yeah, and also I guess because you actually do the work. A lot of people just like say things, and it
Yeah, they're
sounds
just like, it's their default position. Yeah.
and everything. Secondly, Stuart, does your psyche, your view of the world get damaged? Do you feel vulnerable? Do you feel hurt by the world because you see maybe a lot of its dark side? I guess the person is trying to say.
Well, I see dark side, but I see a lot of optimism. Like, if a lot of my effort is studying the civil rights movement. Um, I mean, there's no more inspiring testament to the human spirit than those folks. So yeah, those folks got killed, but they actually persisted despite that. So you could have both kinds of views.
Right. Yeah. What about, do you ever have any fear for your own life? Because you're kind of on the margins with some crazy people now with the internet too and everything.
um, so there've been a couple of times I was going to try and ambush interview a Klan member who's still alive, and then people told me that he's even crazier than he was in the 60s, and he's always carrying a weapon. So I tried to do that indirectly. I still haven't success. I actually have to try and return to that indirectly again. I'm not going to ever ambush interview him. And for a little while, I was wondering if somebody was going to show up and try and plant a bomb under my car or something. But no, these folks are too old, the people who I look into, for me to worry about them.
That's pretty smart because you are Jewish and you are an investigator.
Yeah. I mean, I would have. It's surprising to me sometimes who's willing to actually talk to me on the phone. I usually don't share my last name if I can get it out there, right? So, but yeah, I've talked to Klan members or family of Klan members on the phone. This one is nuts, so I avoid him.
Right. I've had just briefly some experience with people on the edge. I mean, 1-to-1, they could be nice people. It's just, they're human beings too, but then of course they have the other issues and everything. Well, I hope we've covered so much, but can you tell people right now, because everyone should buy one of your books at least, because I find them interesting, easy to read, informative, and well-researched. How can they get Stuart's books?
Easiest way is Amazon.com. If you look for my name, Stuart Wexler, America's Secret Jihad and Killing King are probably the two that I would emphasize. There's also Shadow Warfare, where I co-author some of these books with a gentleman by the name of Larry Hancock. You could look for him as well. But Amazon is easily the best way of getting it. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Wexler Writing.
Okay, and before we leave, any predictions, on anything you've covered, predictions, muses, thoughts to share with the people?
Well, I'm hoping with my podcast on RFK assassination, I have an odd prediction. We're going to get a grand jury that's going to come out of that. That's my prediction.
Interesting.
Because we're going to have some new stuff.
Oh, very good.
And it's not going to be Sirhan's innocent stuff. It's related independently. So
we'll be looking forward to that and hopefully have you back. This has been Breathing with Bimmerman, the podcast. Stuart Wexler, thank you very much.
Thank you.